The simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable.
It should never have happened, and I am deeply sorry.
7 years, 2,500 days, measured in grief. The loss of fathers and mothers, children and friends. Today, official confirmation of what the bereaved and survivors have long known. None of it should ever have happened.
Those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by those who were responsible for ensuring the safety of the building and its occupants. In most cases through incompetence, but in some cases through dishonesty and greed.
For the families today, it was a public acknowledgement of the truth. But now it needs to lead to justice.
Human life was never a priority, and we lost friends, neighbours and loved ones in the most horrific way through greed, corruption, incompetence and negligence. To the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, it's now on to you to deliver justice, to bring charges to those culpable for the deaths of our loved ones.
The final report into the worst residential fire in UK peacetime found a litany of failures at every level. The disaster was the culmination of decades of failure by central government and others in the construction industry, with many missed opportunities to identify the risks posed by combustible cladding and take action. There was systematic dishonesty by companies who made and sold the cladding and insulation, with firms using deliberate and sustained strategies to manipulate, misrepresent, mislead. And even after the disaster had struck, an utter failure by the authorities, whose response was marked by the most basic lack of human decency. Karim Masilhi lost his uncle Hesham, who lived on the very top floor of the tower.
The worst thing about all of this is knowing that every single life could have been saved. That's the hardest part for me. I could stand here and talk to you all day about the issues with the government and them knowing about cladding fire since 1991 and had many of opportunities to do something about it. We'll talk to you about the corporations who systematically manipulated and was dishonest. We can talk all day about the details of what these crooks did, but you know, nothing brings our family back.
In the House of Commons today, the Prime Minister directly addressed survivors and bereaved in the gallery.
I want to start with an apology on behalf of the British state to each and every one of you, and indeed to all of the families affected by this tragedy. You've been let down so badly, before, during, and in the aftermath of this tragedy.
Those chaotic days in the aftermath, proof for survivors of just how little they mattered, how much they had been let down. A Prime Minister who initially visited the area without speaking to the bereaved. Ordinary people, neighbours out on the streets, doing anything they could to help, while Kensington and Chelsea Council floundered. Council unable to relate to its own tenants, according to the inquiry, leaving them feeling abandoned and utterly helpless. So accountability and criminal prosecutions must now follow, survivors say, and not just the corporations and companies. Central to the tragedy, the inquiry found decades of failure by consecutive governments enthralled to deregulation, disinterested in the safety of human beings.
Do you have anything to say to the families of the victims?
Eric Pickles, a housing minister under the Cameron government, said by the inquiry to have enthusiastically supported less regulation, said in a statement today he hoped lessons would be learned.
The system isn't broken, it was built this way. We've had a system that has allowed corporations, politicians to use it for their advantage while ultimately we pay the price. So what are you going to do about it now? It's all there for you in black and white. This has got to now be a moment, a line in the sand moment for Britain.
The Prime Minister said today companies condemned in the Grenfell Tower inquiry will no longer be considered for public contracts, and he promised to speed up removing unsafe cladding from other buildings. He knows the families want radical change, and will accept nothing less, a proper legacy for their loved ones. Each name read out today as the final act of the inquiry.
Join us in remembering them while I read out their names. Fathia Ahmed El Sanusi, Abu Fras Mohammed Ibrahim, Isra Ibrahim.
But this is not the end
Mohammed
of the story.
Sabah Nader.
Anne-Marie Murphy and Bernie Bernard both lost brothers in the fire. Anne-Marie's brother Dennis lived on the 14th floor, while Raymond Bernard, who was known as Moses, lived on the top floor and was hailed a hero for sheltering 6 others who'd headed up trying to escape the flames. They spoke to me about their reaction to the report.
For me, the significance of today's report means that we have finally seen in black and white the failures, the lack of actions, wrong decision making, the lack of regard for human life, which is why 72 people died.
What needs to happen now?
These corporations, they focused purely on profit, and they need to feel the pain that they have caused to all of us bereaved and survivors. They will never understand the trauma that now is in our lives for the rest of our lives.
For those responsible, they need to be held accountable in a criminal court and face severe sentences. And the sentences need to reflect the magnitude of their actions or inactions.
How optimistic are you that you will get justice?
For me, I have to hope, and I live in hope that there will be change, because if I lose that hope, what then?
Our loved ones, both my brother and Anne's brother, died in a horrific way. My Moses was cremated in that building. And so for me, justice is not just to remember that horrific morning, but also for the legacy that should be left.
You talk about legacy for both your brothers. Today must be phenomenally difficult. Every day must be difficult. But what are your thoughts about them today?
Moses himself didn't have very much. That is in the way of assets. But whatever he had, he would share with anybody that he came into contact with. And everybody in that tower knew him for that reason, because he was a giver and a protector. And what's happened with this tragedy is that it blocks some of the good memories I have of Moses because of the trauma behind it all. Because when I think about my brother, I have to think about him in that inferno.
My most standout memory of Dennis was how much he loved. He didn't have financial wealth, but he was so rich in a human nature that was selfless, caring, loving, and you can't buy that. I talk to Dennis every day. I tell him how proud I am to be his sister. Yeah, I tell him how proud I am to be his sister and how lucky I was to have been loved by him.
Well, Well, the report lays out a path to disaster at Grenfell, which dates back to the early 1990s. Paul McNamara takes a closer look at who is to blame and when, or if, they are ever likely to be truly held accountable and brought to justice.
As the evidence-gathering process ended back in 2022, the lead counsel to the inquiry said the companies and organisations involved had spun a web of blame. He showed them this, a maze of everyone blaming everyone else and denying responsibility. He said evidence of incompetence, malpractice and dishonesty were there. Today, pretty much everyone in this chart gets strongly criticised. And it begins with central government and the department in charge of housing. The criticism transcends party politics. The fire assessor report was the culmination of decades of failure from government and the construction industry. But since 2009, it says, the government's deregulatory agenda, enthusiastically supported by the Secretary of State, that was the Conservative Eric Pickles at the time, now Lord Pickles, dominated the department's thinking to such an extent that even matters affecting the safety of life were ignored, delayed and disregarded. By 2016, the department was well aware of the risks of cladding, but failed to act. Governments come up with the policy. It's then the role of regulators to set the standards and testing and certification bodies to make sure those standards are met. Again, failure of one, incompetence, said the report, and an ingrained willingness to accommodate customers instead of insisting on high standards. The customers are these, the companies that made the cladding and insulation that was the main cause of the fire. Arconic, Celotex, owned by the French giant Saint-Gobain, and Kingspan. These firms, the report accuses of systematic dishonesty. They have manipulated the testing process, misrepresented test data, and misled the market. Specifically, to Arconic, the company that made the flammable cladding, Arconic was, the report says, determined to exploit what it saw as a weak regulatory regime in certain countries, including the UK, despite having been aware of the dangers since 2005. Not an oversight, says the report, a deliberate strategy. Arconic denies concealing information and rejects claims it sold unsafe products. The installation companies were also criticised. Celotex embarked on a dishonest scheme to mislead its customers and the wider market. Kingspan cynically exploited the industry's lack of detailed knowledge about building regulations. Celotex has told us it has reviewed and improved process control, quality management, and the approach to marketing since the fire. And Kingspan said it acknowledged the wholly unacceptable historical failings that occurred. And the industry body, the safety body, the BBA, has said that it is reviewing the report and remains fully committed to driving safety and quality in construction. So what consequences do any of these companies and bodies and the people behind them face? Well, the report doesn't discuss criminal blame. That's the job of the police. They're investigating 19 companies or organisations and 58 individuals. This is what they said today.
What we will be doing now, alongside our criminal investigation, is forensically reading the inquiry's report line by line, bringing that work and any additional inquiries we might need to make with our evidence and our investigation, with a view to going to the Crown Prosecution Service for a decision on whether individuals or organisations or companies may be charged.
Those charges, though, are not expected for another 2 years. This inquiry began 3 months after the Grenfell Tower fire. It has cost, at last estimate, around £170 million. Further financial costs, the fallout, are much higher, a rising total of more than £1.3 billion to date. But the true cost of the disaster is incalculable. What value can ever be placed on 72 lives lost? How do you ever measure the toll on the devastated families left behind? And 7 years later, it will still be yet more years to come before anyone faces consequences for what happened.
Paul McNamara there. Well, the report makes 58 recommendations to overhaul regulation of the construction sector, improve government oversight and the response of the fire service. They include creating a building industry regulator and the government bringing all fire safety functions into one department. Grenfell United, which is formed of survivors and bereaved families, made this direct appeal to the Prime Minister.
Today, we send a message to Keir Starmer and his government. This country has been failed by governments of all political persuasions. Our expectation is your government will break old habits and implement all the recommendations without further delay.
Well, as you heard, the Prime Minister has promised to respond to the report's recommendations, pledging to force action to remove dangerous cladding where necessary. Only last month, the government revealed that 4,630 buildings still have unsafe cladding, leaving thousands of residents living in fear of another Grenfell. A little earlier, I spoke to the Housing Minister, Matthew Pennycook, about the government's response to the report and the demands from Grenfell United. But I began by asking whether this is a shaming moment for the country.
I think that would be a fair assessment to make. We always knew the report would be damning, but it is quite shocking to see it set out in black and white. As you say, both the pernicious industry practice, but also the failure of government in terms of overseeing a fragmented and deficient regulatory regime.
Now, the Prime Minister gave a powerful statement today, apologising first and foremost, accepting that the country let the families of Grenfell down. The question now is, what does your government do? How quickly does it implement these recommendations? Can it promise it will implement all of them?
What needs to happen now in the aftermath of it is the pursuit of justice to proceed, so that very large, legally complex police investigation to proceed at pace. We want to see justice secured for the survivors, for the bereaved and the wider community. But you're absolutely right, government needs to act both in terms of speeding up the pace of remediation, but what more we need to do across the board to ensure that all homes are made safe. And we will be looking at each of the recommendations very carefully and acting on them, reporting back within the next 6 months as to how we intend to respond to each.
I mean, what the family said to me today is that both government and you in opposition talked about speeding up, accelerating the process of making homes safe, those homes where we know thousands of people are going to bed tonight with unsafe cladding on their buildings. They want to know that that is going to be done really quickly. What sort of timetable can you put on that?
You're absolutely right. They want and they deserve to know that that remediation action is going to take place quickly, because the pace of remediation across the country over recent years has been glacial, and we need to turn that around. Which is precisely why we're going to issue a remediation action plan later in the autumn that sets out very clearly how we think we can speed up the pace of remediation across the country, because far too many people, including many tens of thousands of leaseholders, are trapped physically and mentally in their properties. They're paying, in many cases, huge financial secondary costs for being in those properties.
Absolutely.
And we absolutely are determined to speed up the pace of remediation across the country.
We understand exactly what the problem is, but the families are saying to me today, in opposition, you've known what the problem is. You yourself said over a year ago that it had to be accelerated. Why do you not have a plan to be put into progress right now?
Well, there's lots of work that needs to take place to pull that strategy together, if I'm honest. And we've discovered things on taking office just over 8 weeks ago that we weren't even clear about. For example, we don't know precisely the number of buildings that might have combustible cladding on them. So there is an absolute job of work to do in terms of speeding up the remediation. But I think people across the country living in these buildings can be assured.
Even though this is a problem you have been looking at in opposition.
We have been looking at it in opposition, but we don't have access to all the data that you do in government. We've been in office for 8 weeks. The Prime Minister set out today a number of steps that we intend to take in the short term. We're going to respond to each of the recommendations that the inquiry made within the next 6 months as quickly as possible as we can, and we'll be bringing forward that plan in the autumn.
The Prime Minister talked today about banning any companies who've been condemned by the Grenfell inquiry from getting new contracts. Does that extend to companies who may have contracts right now?
Well, the Prime Minister made very clear in the statement earlier in the House of Commons that he intends to write to those companies cited in the report as a first step to stopping them being awarded government contracts. And that's absolutely the right thing to do.
Understood, but just on the point that Keir Starmer has made today about any companies condemned not getting future contracts, if they are not fit for future contracts, they're not fit for current contracts, are they? So would you anticipate ending contracts that are currently in place?
Well, it's my understanding that the 4 companies cited in the report don't have existing contracts. I think what the Prime Minister was alluding to today was writing to those companies as a first step to stopping them getting future government contracts.
Matthew Pennycook, Minister, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you very much.